Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Shazi, and especially thank you, Ivan. Really want to say that although we both are labeled as co-organizers, almost all of the hard and important work for organizing this workshop was done by Ivan. So if something doesn't work out, he's to blame. Really thank you, Johannes. That was great work. So the purpose of my talk today here is really twofold. On the one hand, I want to disseminate and maybe advertise the work on Neuratian thought experiments that Ivan and I did in one published and one forthcoming paper. But then I mainly want to talk about the second purpose, because thinking about our work on thought experiments, on Neurath, engendered other ideas for me, that some of those ideas might be applicable in a completely different context, namely in the methodology of economics and in debates on reasoning with models in economics. And that's obviously a very big topic in the philosophy of economics. If you go to the INEM conference, which is the big philosophy of economics conference, you can probably spend all 3 days just in panels on modeling, methodology of modeling and reasoning with models. And there's obviously a lot of really great work done in that area, covering very different questions from the ethics of modeling to more technical, small m methodology of economics, to broader questions of methodology. So a lot of great work done, but from the perhaps overly pedantic perspective of someone who was also trained in mathematical logic, some aspects of modeling don't receive sufficient attention, in my opinion. And maybe some of the ideas that I have, that I take from the literature of thought experiments, can help to tackle some of these underdeveloped aspects in the reasoning with models literature. And I'll say in a minute what aspects those are. I mean that this problem of reasoning with models doesn't really exist, or isn't really problematic in the case where there's just one model world involved. So I have one abstract model world and I study that. Usually this model world is described in economics in highly mathematized form, and what's going on here is relatively well understood. As I said, the model is typically described in mathematized form, so the inferences can be tracked quite easily. You can make rigorous arguments, and for checking those arguments, there's relatively high intersubjective agreement possible, both for humans, and you can, for some of those arguments, you can even have them checked by computers. But very often, I think economists don't just want to talk about one model world, but they want to make inferences to what the real world looks like, or they want to use different models and they claim to make inferences using different models and infer another model or infer something about what they call the real world. And then things get a lot messier quite quickly. So a very typical case is certainly this: I have one model, or the economist has one model, shows something for this model and wants to make an inference about some property, what the economist calls the real world. I mentioned the example that there might be more than one model involved. One colleague started to count the models that appear in the Wealth of Nations, and he said he stopped counting when he reached 300. He wasn't through. Then there's also a lot of literature on this kind of uneasiness that some economists and many methodologists of economics feel with the structure of typical economics papers, in which oftentimes you find an introduction where in very loose terms you find a description of real-world phenomena, say with the very famous Schelling example about housing, segregation in housing in big US cities. Then in the main part of the paper, there's a highly mathematized model, and in mathematized form some arguments about that model are made. And in the conclusion, there are again a few thoughts on what to infer about segregation of housing in US cities, or about some other relatively detached real-world phenomenon. And it's not at all clear in many of those papers what exactly the relation between those real-world phenomena and in the introduction and in the conclusion and the model in the main part, in the so-called main part of the paper is. Some of the emerging literature now deals with the notion of narrative and tries to use this notion of narrative as being used in the introduction and the conclusion, and the narrative oftentimes having the function of linking what they call the real-world phenomena to the model. But what exactly is going on there is, from a logical perspective, relatively unclear and oftentimes relatively messy. So the idea is of this project that I'm starting with is to reconstruct and maybe to enlighten a bit the logical structure of such arguments. And the argument is really what happens in the whole paper, what is claimed in the conclusion about the real world phenomena, and not just what's happening in the abstract mathematical structure. And this argument that economists want to make is then often criticized by others, so I suppose it's fair to say that certainly economists and philosophers do want to make arguments, want to discuss the validity and soundness of those arguments. They want maybe to check their theories for consistency, they want to criticize, criticism is another kind of argument typically. They may aim for intersubjective agreement, and they want to make inferences, they claim to make inferences with models, for instance. But from a logical perspective, and here in Florianópolis I don't have to explain that very, very long, the notion of truth value is something we need when we talk about the validity of arguments. And also for rules of inference, we need for making inferences, we need something like rules of inference. But truth values and rules of inferences, we have relatively well understood notions for that for sentences, but not for models. So this talk that you find in many economics papers, and from my perspective, unfortunately also in a lot of methodology of economics papers, we find notion such as a false model. For anyone with some introductory logic course, that's kind of problematic. We know what it means for a sentence to be true or false in a model, but it's not immediately clear what a false model is supposed to be. Similarly, when economists talk about using model A and model B and making an inference to something, models as the object of inference, that's also not really clear. I haven't seen rules of inference with models as the objects. I know sentences, I know a lot of inferences with sentences as the objects, but it's not so clear whether there are out there rules of inference for models. So if we want, the point is, if we want to make arguments, discuss their validity, if we want to make inferences, we have to somehow boil it down to the level of sentences, or create rules of inferences for models, and create concepts for what it means to be a true model. That would be another route that I won't pursue here. And the idea that I'm gonna follow here is to draw on the literature of thought experiments. One motivating observation here is that in thought experiments you have these counterfactual scenarios, these oftentimes quite absurd sounding counterfactual scenarios. In the philosophy of mind you have the zombies running around. They are the centerpiece of a thought experiment. They are not the entire thought experiment, there are other elements, I'll reconstruct what they are. But the central part of a thought experiment is this counterfactual scenario. And this is similar to at least some economics papers where you have this model in the main part as the centerpiece, but the model doesn't do all the work for the overall argument of the paper. You have these other elements, mostly in the introduction and in the conclusion, which somehow, but it's not so clear how, together make the argument of the whole economics paper. More specifically, I'll use a weak version of the so-called argument view of thought experiments, which is due to Norton, which basically says that thought experiments, and Norton would say all thought experiments, can at least be reconstructed as arguments on the level of sentences. So what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about a more specific notion of the argument view, which is due to Søren Hækkerup, his template, how to reconstruct thought experiments as arguments of a specific structure. And Ivan and I did some work on that. I'll show you two examples from the history of economics, or you might say from the history of political economy, that use this in which we used this template to reconstruct two Neurachian thought experiments in this Hækkerup template. And then I'll give this outlook that claiming that some of the elements of this reconstruction of thought experiments can be used to inform the debate on reasoning with models in economics, but I'll also highlight some of the difficulties in going directly to economics, because I will argue that there are a few complications and differences between the case of philosophical thought experiments and the reasoning of models that happens in economics. So let's start with what's this Hækkerup template. Again, that's in the tradition of this argument view by Norton, which says when we have a thought experiment, for many purposes it's helpful to reconstruct it as an argument. And Hækkerup claims that all, or at least almost all, thought experiments can be reconstructed as consisting of four parts. One being a philosophical theory, background theory, Chekhov. Sorry. T. Then you have a description of a counterfactual scenario and the claim that this scenario is possible C. And again, especially in philosophy, sometimes these are quite counterfactual scenarios which are quite far out there, like the twin Earth or zombies. And the theory can be almost any philosophical theory, from semantic externalism to physicalism, materialism, theories of knowledge, theories of justice. So any philosophical theory that you can think of, basically. Then you have what's typically the main philosophical argument, which boils down to the claim that the philosophical theory implies that if this counterfactual scenario would be the case, then a certain state W would occur, or in ethical thought experiments, you should do something W, some action W. And then you have the fourth part, which kind of disregards any philosophical education, and you go to a layman, tell him about the counterfactual scenario, and ask if C were the case, what would happen? And drawing on the intuition of someone you tell this story, according to Hækkerup, you get, in this reconstruction, you get non-W as the result. So one typical example here would be which many of you probably know, is the trolley thought experiment. You have as a background theory some version of utilitarianism. You describe the scenario in which a trolley runs down a track, and it would kill 5 people, but you have the option of pushing an obese person in front of the trolley and thereby kill this person but stop the trolley and save the other 5. Now, according to empirical experiments, the intuition of many people says do not push as the result. So if the trolley scenario were the case, you should not push, but arguably, if you apply a reasonably refined version of your utilitarianism, then utilitarianism implies if that scenario were the case, then you should push. Now, Hækkerup claims that in most cases, the intended argument to be reconstructed from a thought experiment is a criticism of the philosophical background theory. So you take the other 3 components, and the argument is supposed to show the negation of the theory. So utilitarianism is not the case. But Hequist acknowledges and then it clearly delineates that there are also the three other possibilities. So you could say, well, intuitions aren't really that reliable or important. You shouldn't trust them. You should just bite the bullet and negate your intuition. That's the part you should get rid of. And that's what the argument of the thought experiment really aims to show. Then a lot of philosophical papers are written arguing that if you really refine utilitarianism in the correct way, then utilitarianism doesn't really imply that you should do W in this scenario. So you can also attack and criticize this part of the Hequist template. And there's the fourth possibility that the argument of the underlying argument of the thought experiment to be reconstructed is really no, in the relevant sense of possibility, this scenario is not possible. So you have these, according to Hequist, you have at least those four argument types related to each philosophical thought experiment and also to thought experiments in science. Now what Ivan and I did is a slight reformulation of Hequist's template, which we think is in better accordance with the situation, especially in philosophy, where there's almost no thought experiment where there is an agreement what to infer from these thought experiments and what to conclude from the thought experiment. So, at least in philosophy and maybe in other cases as well, we think it's fair to say that the thought experiment the argument to be reconstructed from the thought experiment is that if you hold all the four components of the Hequist template, then you get P and non-P for an arbitrary sentence P. Again, assuming classical logic, of course, which is kind of unpopular here, I understand. That's the idea. So then you have to make a decision on what to do if you want to avoid explosion, which we assume is really what everyone wants to do. Of course, you could go the way of saying, I change the underlying logic, I change the sense of possibility, I go the paraconsistent route, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, and especially tomorrow, it's the day dedicated to paraconsistency. But if we stay within something some kind of logic close enough to classical logic, which leads to this problem that we get explosion when we combine those four elements of the Hequist template, then you have to make a decision to drop or to alter one of the four components. And a crucial point that we highlight and that we think is very much in accordance with Neurath's thought of philosophy and of the sciences is that neither logic nor the thought experiments tell you which of the four parts to drop. There's an active decision to be made by the thought experimenter, by the scientist, by the philosopher, which of the four components to discard. So that's the background. Maybe any quick questions on the template before I continue? Okay. Yeah, let's reconstruct two examples that Neurath gives in his work in political economy. And this is the more political case, which is simpler and I think for us as philosophers of thought experiment and also for Neurath was the more uninteresting one, but it's simpler, so I'll start with that one. So we have the four components of the Hequist template. The background theory here is what Neurath at his time, that's mainly before and shortly after the First World War, what he considered to be the economic and political background theory of mainstream economics at his time. And according to Neurath, that included the claim that private property of the means of production and competition brings about optimal overall societal outcome. Now, C is a description of one of many Neurathian utopias. He constructed many different ways of how to socialize the means of production and described them. So for this example, just take one of them and make the claim that it's possible to do that. Then, disregarding the economic background theory, what scientific utopianism does is using scientific methods to develop what would be the case if we implemented those rules and regulations that of the scientific utopia. And important for Neurath is that you should do this along a lot of different dimensions, like housing conditions, infant mortality, literacy, leisure hours. So those are quite well known also today in the literature. But Neurath gives also some a bit weirder examples, like how many hours do you have time each day to sing in front of a bonfire? How many lice do you have on your head? The point is, for Neurath, it's really crucial that this evaluation of welfare in the intuitive case and also in the scientific case should be made along different dimensions, and which are not really dimensions in the sense that they are not reducible. So you don't have one index number describing societal welfare, but you have to look at different ones. And Neurath claims that if you present this utopia and show the scientific evidence what would happen in this utopia, then almost all citizens would make the claim non-W, saying that this utopia is actually superior to the current, according to Neurath, capitalistic state. Whereas, trivially, the background theory T implies if you apply the utopia, which is different from the capitalistic system, you get W, you get an inferior state. So you get the inconsistent, the problematic inconsistency, and the intended consequence intended by Neurath, obviously it was to reject the background theory and socialize the means of production and live in one of his socialist utopias. Let's switch to the quite similar but harder and, according to Neurath, more interesting case. He always insisted he's a theoretical political economist, not a practical one. So he's interested in the foundations of the discipline of economics, of political economy. And this thought experiment is very much in line, this harder case is very much in line with what Thomas Kuhn considered to be the main function of thought experiments, namely to challenge the conceptual basis of a scientific discipline. Let's see how that goes. Again, Neurath has this economic and political background theory of his time, or what he considered to be this background theory. But now we have quite explicit a specific notion of superiority for social orders, and this notion of superiority is in terms of monetary calculation. That's the language Neurath uses. In contemporary language, it's basically a kind of cost-benefit analysis. And the background theory T includes the claim that for all relevant cases, this notion of superiority in terms of monetary calculation is extensionally interchangeable with a more intuitive notion. That is, if you just ask citizens in which social order do you want to live and explain it sufficiently, then you get the same results as if you apply this specified notion of cost-benefit analysis. The outcome, which social order is superior, is the same according to the background theory. So SM gives you an adequate picture of what people think what is superior. And then you proceed in a very similar way. You describe one of the Neurathian utopias, again with socialized means of production. You say that's possible. Then again, the theory, including the cost-benefit notion of cost-benefit analysis and applying that notion, would say that the utopia, the socialist utopia, is inferior, whereas asking citizens just intuitively which of those described scenarios is the scenario which you would like to live in, then you would get the utopia is superior, and you get the problematic inconsistency again. But what Neurath argues in many papers is that, and what we take to be the real goal of those thought experiments, is to rethink how to frame the notion of well-being or of welfare in the discipline of economics, and thereby to broaden the scope of which phenomena economics engages with. So drop this notion of superiority in terms of monetary calculation and broaden the horizon of what economics deals with, not just phenomena which are directly related to monetary exchange, but also all of these other dimensions of welfare which are crucial and which, according to Neurath, are not reducible to anything expressible in monetary terms. So that's the main part of this theoretical side of Neurath's utopianism, to quote from Neurath, that the methodological axiom of Neurath, quote by Nemeth, is to construct the subject matter you were dealing with in economics, wealth or quality of life, as an ensemble of heterogeneous elements, and to not presume that in its heterogeneity might on a deeper level be reduced to one single element. That's a discussion we still have today in economics to some extent just because those Neurathian voices aren't really loud in the discipline, but they are still around. Okay, there are a few problems or open questions how to actually implement such a proposal of the social engineer making these proposals to the public, but I'll skip that. We can maybe talk about it in the Q&A if you want to. And I'll go to my final part, this outlook, how to apply this Hequist model to at least some cases in contemporary economics, or in economics in general. So in philosophy, or in many philosophical thought experiments, you have those four parts, and the main philosophical argument, so to speak, happens here. When the philosophical theory, we have utilitarianism as an example, is applied to the actual case. So that's where the philosophical magic happens, so to speak. And that's, in comparison to economics, I will argue at least, relatively vague. I mean, in analytical philosophy, there are steps towards formalization, but still, this is the crucial part, and it's not highly formalized typically in the thought experiment literature. Now, in economics, in a typical economics paper, and we can take the Schelling example again, or examples from game theory. What I think in many examples can be reconstructed here is that what's the theory in here is much less developed and much vaguer than the philosophical theory. So typically the background theory T in the economics paper is the non-technical, very vague description of the everyday phenomena, like housing situation in North America. That's where the narrative happens. So it's the theory is the propositional content of the narrative in many examples, I will argue. You also have the scenario, that's typically the model in the central part of the economics paper. These are oftentimes much, in a vague sense, much closer to the real world. They are not as far out there as the philosophical examples, but there are also quite far models with the counterfactual scenarios in economics with a great distance. Let's put it like this from the real world. Yes, you also have the application of the background theory T to the scenario. That's what usually happens in the conclusion or in the narrative, in a very sloppy, hand-waving fashion. Where the economic magic happens, where the main economic argument happens, is, in contrast to philosophy, in this part of the Hequist template, I argue. That's when the highly formalized model, without any regard for what has been said in the introduction, is studied. The properties of this abstract model are studied. This is used this is usually done in a highly mathematized form. So this is where a lot of rigor is present, and where there's not so much disagreement. So this part, the economic argument, is relatively exact. But this economic argument in the main part of the paper doesn't do all the work which is purported to be done by the paper. Meyer calls this the problem of the weakest link. So economists arguably invest a lot of time and resources into making the economic argument here more and more rigorous and more exact. But there's very little work done in making the overall argument more understandable, clearer, and more rigorous. So how again, how this highly mathematized model and its description relate to the claim about the real world that the paper aims to make or pretends to make, that's highly unclear, and economists typically don't invest a lot of time in arguing that part. And the overall argument is just as strong as its weakest link. So maybe the resources are not ideally allocated, is what a lot of methodologists of economics claim. Too many resources run into making this part more and more rigorous. Relatedly, there is this kind of difference where typical criticisms are aimed at. In philosophy, in the philosophical literature using thought experiments, you really have criticisms on all four parts. So all the four types of arguments that Hequist made are really present, and all four parts of the template are attacked and criticized. In economics, arguments against this fourth part are relatively rare. Also, arguments that the scenario is somehow impossible are relatively rare. We give one example in a footnote from Mises' Evenly Rotating Economy. But typically, criticisms of the overall argument in the economics paper aim at the first and the third part. That's the weakest link, that's where the criticism is aimed at, because it's not really clear how the relation is. In principle, it would again be possible to criticize any of the four, but what typically happens in discussions in economics is that criticisms are leveled at those 2 points. So some examples, I mentioned the 2 Neurath examples from the history. I think the Schelling example with some reservations is very well reconstructible in the Hequist template. Many examples from game theory are reconstructible in that way, but certainly not all of them. And certainly there are a few complications in many economics cases, and I will hint at 2 of them. So in a second paper that was accepted this week actually, Ivan and I looked at the discussions 70s, 80s, 90s in Germany about Energiewende, so that the switch to renewable energies in providing energy in Germany. And on a quite official level, 4 scenarios were created and then scientifically investigated and publicly debated which of the 4 scenarios, which of those 4 routes for policy to take. And arguably those are not so dissimilar from the Neurathian utopias. So you have 4 scenarios, and there are arguments made about the background theory and about the relation between those 4 scenarios and about the real world, the so-called real world. So you have the argument here doesn't have just the theory and 1 scenario, but the theory and at least 4 scenarios. And we showed that a template, not just like Hequist, but a very similar template can be used to reconstruct some of the arguments made in this Energiewende debate. And yeah, okay. You will hear more about that from Ivan. Point is, this reasoning with models, reasoning with scenarios, which happens in this case, can be brought down to the level of sentences where we can understand arguments, where we understand what it means to make inferences. But we have to slightly adapt the Hequist template. A maybe harder problem is that it's not so clear whether the narrative in the introduction in many papers is really the same theory or is even consistent with the theory of the model, that is all sentences which are true in the model, in the main part. So arguably in many economics papers, and probably, so I try to boil it down to 1 theory, but probably an adequate reconstruction of the Schelling model, of the Schelling paper that I hinted at a few times, actually requires you to have 2 theories. The theory in the narrative and the theory of the model. And then 1 or 2 scenarios. So my point here overall in the talk is not that the Hequist template is something really special that should be applied to all kinds of cases in economics, but templates like that can be helpful to drag the so-called argument made with models down to the level of sentences where we really understand what the argument is, where we can check validity and soundness more properly, and where we understand what it means to make inferences on that level. This is from another forthcoming paper of mine about game theory, and yeah, I just want to highlight that the situation can be really complicated. As logicians, you know, whenever you have a model, you have the theory of the model. It's not so clear whether the theory in the introduction is consistent with the theory of those models. You have somehow as a target system oftentimes the real world, so-called real world. What you do to make arguments here is that you have one or many models as proxies to stand in for the real world. Those generate the theories of those proxy models. So the situation, I looked at that in game theory to some extent, might be quite complicated in some papers, but nothing prevents you from trying to reconstruct what the argument using many of those models and maybe some theories to reconstruct it on the level of sentences. So to sum up, I think economists, social scientists, natural scientists, philosophers want to understand, they want to make arguments, they want to criticize, they want to make inferences, and arguably for many of those practices, for many of those activities, we do need truth values and rules of inference, and conceptually we have those for sentences, but not really for models. So, and that creates, for the pedantic logician, some kind of problem in understanding what's going on when economists reason with models. I tried to argue or sketch an argument that some economic models are centerpieces of thought experiments, and according to Norton, thought experiments can be reconstructed as arguments, and I support Norton here. Reasoning with economic models and with narratives can sometimes be reconstructed in Hequist's template. I showed you 2 examples and hinted at one half example additionally. More importantly, reasoning with economic models and narratives can often be reconstructed in templates, and not necessarily the Hequist one. It can be a very simple template. In a lot of examples, you will just have one model, a second model which is kind of the proxy stand-in for the real world, and a theory. And the argument is that the theory is true in the abstract model, and the theory is true in the stand-in for the real world. That will be the structure in many economics models, but there are more interesting, more intricate cases. I mentioned the Adam Smith case. If there's one overarching argument in the Wealth of Nations, it includes at least 300 scenarios, according to Linsbichler. So, yes, using those templates, we might get to actually understanding what, from a logical perspective, what reasoning with models is. And I'd go out with a slightly more argumentative claim. If reasoning with economic models and narratives cannot be reconstructed in a framework with rules of inference, then maybe we should not call it reasoning, but rather motivated guessing. I understand it was just a sketch of how I, in the future, want to apply some of the elements of the thought experiment literature and other templates which are not from the thought experiment literature to make sense of some of the things which are going on when economists and other scientists reason with models. And I understand there's a lot of work to be done in that area. But I hope some of your comments and questions will help me do this work. Thank you.